I think it was no minor thing that both Melania Trump and Ivanka came off without a headdress. That they're, again, if you notice, the interpreter who's with the president does not have on a headdress. I mean, there's a gradual signal here to women in Saudi Arabia that their future, I think this year they're going to probably be allowed to go without a headdress, and they're probably going to be allowed to drive. That may not seem like a giant breakthrough, but the very fact that
And in this Fox News alert, this is the president arriving moments ago in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to speak in front of those Arab heads of state, where he will deliver an address on fighting radical extremism in that part of the world, cooperation with the Arab world to fight radical Islam. And it's going to be a historic speech in mere moments.
And we're going to be playing it right here live on this channel very shortly. He was the last guest to arrive for the Arab Islamic American Summit luncheon. There you see greeting the King of Saudi Arabia, as he has so many other times, and then quickly thereafter taking his seat as the guest of honor for this luncheon. And he will be the keynote speaker at that luncheon, addressing the entire world and the Arab world.
Yeah, we now want to bring in former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, a perfect voice for this morning as we await this big speech. Speaker, what do you think of this trip so far, and what do you hope to hear in just a few moments?
Well, first of all, the most important single statement was Egyptian President al-Sisi, who said Donald Trump is a unique man. He achieves the impossible. And I think that's a remarkable comment, which I hope the American news media will take seriously and think long and hard about. The combination of the Saudis and the Americans bringing together virtually every leader in the Arab world for this summit, and the speech that I know the president will give in the very near future, I've seen parts of it. It is historic and remarkable, and I think that it sets the stage for us to decisively defeat radical Islam and do so in alliance with the moderate Islamists who are going to be gathered at this particular event. So, finally, of course, if you're the president and you're worried about jobs, the various contracts they're signing are extraordinary steps towards helping the American economy keep growing.
Right. That underlines this entire speech, this entire trip. It's the business interests of this region, of course. I want to get your take on this. You mentioned some of the excerpts of the speech that you've been reading, that we've been playing and talking about this morning. Here, confronting radical Islam is one of the excerpts from that speech that Mr. Trump is going to present in just a few minutes. And it reads this way: "That means honestly confronting the crisis of Islamist extremism and the Islamist terror groups it inspires. And it means standing together against the murder of innocent Muslims, the oppression of women, the persecution of Jews, and the slaughter of Christians." How will that be received, Mr. Speaker?
Well, I think it's going to be received pretty well, because finally, after years of talking with them, the major leaders in the region understand that these radicals are a direct threat to them. I mean, the Saudis aren't just acting out of the goodness of their heart. They're acting to survive, because they have a two-front war. They have radical Islamists on the one front who would like to overthrow the regime, and they have Iran on the other front who would like to occupy the country. And so they have been forced by reality into becoming our allies. And let me note, by the way, because I already watched one of the other networks trying desperately to draw a gap between what Trump said as a candidate and what Trump is saying here. This is a very strong, very direct speech being given right there in the face of all of these major leaders. He pulls no punches. He talks about persecuting Jews, persecuting Christians. He talks about women's rights. And he uses the word Islamist, which is technically the right word, because it refers to the political movement, not the religion. But it's you compare this speech to Obama in Cairo, and you'll see the difference between appeasement and cowardice on the one hand with Obama, and a clear, direct statement of what we need to do on the part of the president.
That's such a great point about the clear delineation of exactly what we're up against. Another portion of the speech that's been released in advance of his remarks we want to get your reaction to. It says that the president is expected to say this, that this is not a battle between different faiths, different sects, or different civilizations. This is a battle between barbaric criminals who seek to obliterate human life and decent people of all religions who seek to protect it. This is a battle between good and evil. Very stark moral terms there, and blunt talk.
Look, it also tells you something about the scale of President Trump's ambitions. Here's a man who, on his very first overseas trip, doesn't go to Canada, doesn't go to Mexico, which the last two presidents did. He goes on this huge swing for 9 days. And what's he trying to do? He's trying to reach out to Islam, Christianity, and Judaism on the same trip. And he's trying to say, can I help bring together the three great monotheistic religions? This is a very ambitious, very bold step.
Yeah.
And so far, I think there's some signs it's beginning to pay off. The biggest single practical thing out of today may be the establishment of a counterterrorism center at Riyadh, which frankly in 1990 would have been totally unthinkable.
Yeah.
Would have been impossible.
Also, Speaker, Iran. I mean, you think about what's overshadowing much of this trip. He's there in Saudi Arabia, then going to Jerusalem. You think about the one place that is most concerning, as Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said yesterday, is Iran and this threat. And maybe that's part of the warm welcome we've seen with President Trump here, as he has said, I'm not in favor of this Iran deal. I want to come down harder on them. He takes them very, very seriously.
Well, you know, Cliff and I watched Secretary Tillerson's press conference with the with the Saudi foreign minister. And it was very interesting that at the beginning of the press conference, the two of them were talking about the fact that they've known each other for years because the largest foreign investor in Saudi Arabia is ExxonMobil. And I think we don't fully appreciate this is a trip made possible by an extraordinary national security team, including General McMaster and General Mattis and Rex Tillerson. And it's that team which has set up, I think, maybe the most remarkable trip ever by an American president to the Middle East.
We're awaiting the president's remarks in front of the leaders of the Arab world. It's going to be a historic speech, and we'll carry it live for you. We're joined by the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. I want to get your take while we await his speech on the controversies and problems that he's facing back here at home, which are still ongoing. We know that former head of the FBI, James Comey, will testify now in front of the Senate and speak for the first time. We have the special counsel also now unfolding in Robert Mueller. What do you make of James Comey testifying before the Senate? What do you expect to hear?
Well, look, let me just start and say 90% of everything that you're describing is garbage. It will not be remembered in history. It is garbage. There's a study out from Harvard, I think yesterday or the day before. One network was 93% negative about the President of the United States in the first 4 months. 93%.
Yeah, we did that story this morning.
CBS, ABC, CNN, 93, 93, 91, right. New York Times, 87. Fox News Channel, by the way, right down the middle at 50-50.
And by the way, I was in Kiev at the beginning of this week, and the impact of CNN in particular in communicating a negative view of America is unimaginable. They are worse than Al Jazeera and worse than Pravda because people think they represent America, and at 93-7 negative against the president, they're doing an enormous amount of damage around the world. But here's reality. The world's now watching this guy that they've heard all this negative about. He looks like a president. He acts like a president. All of the Arab leaders are treating him like he's the president. He's cutting huge deals that are going to create American jobs. And he's about to give a historic speech that I believe will resonate all across the world.
But nevertheless, he is still facing this stuff back home. And we have heard reports of staff members, of course, leaks. Karl Rove yesterday on our show saying, look, it's coming right from his staff. And, something's got to change in there.
That's right. He's got to think about the extraordinary nature of this foreign trip, the team that put it together. And then he's got to say, now, how do I get the same consistency and the same rhythm here at home? Reagan did that by being very disciplined, something Trump has not wanted to do yet. And let's be clear, a good part of his problem at home is him. He gets up and tweets about something and gives the news media an excuse to spend all day battering him. Notice how careful he's being overseas.
Right.
I mean, when Trump is careful and when Trump is big, he's an enormous historic figure who will change history.
So don't even bring up this Russian investigation, right, Speaker? When you come home, keep the narrative on this trip, keep it on what the American people care about.
But did you see the one question yesterday? They're finishing up the Tillerson Saudi foreign minister, and one American reporter, I don't know who it was, but one American reporter couldn't help herself, and she had to try to ask Tillerson about the Russian stuff. This is so pathetic and so myopic and so lacking in any sense of seriousness. And I think Trump ought to just take on the news media in a very calm way and say, look, I'm a real president. You are fake reporters. Let's have the right relationship between a real president and fake reporters. And I've said publicly, I would cancel all the daily briefings. They do them no good. There's no possible way for Spicer to deal with all those reporters, and it makes the reporters look like they're normal, which they're not. They're almost all of them are opponents of Trump.
Of course, when you say Democrats and media, you're actually repeating yourself.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, when you talk about the garbage, you also had a great op-ed recently speaking to Trump supporters, saying, "Hey, you elected this guy for a reason. Now is the time to stand with him." I was at a diner in Michigan on Friday talking to Trump supporters, and they're clear to the camera saying, "Mr. President, we are with you. We support you, regardless of what the fake news media says." What is your message to conservatives conservatives to Republicans to Trump Democrats who cross that line, and they're hearing all this noise and this garbage. What's your message to them?
My message to them is look at the real history you're watching today. Look at the real achievements you're watching today. Look at the jobs the president is creating. Look at what he's doing to unify the Arab world against radical Islamists. And then ask yourself, would you rather go back to the failure, the weakness, the appeasement, the cowardice of the Democrats? Or would you want to stay the course and get this done? And I think, frankly, Trump is going to end up being a very historic figure. I think that he will win re-election. And I think in the process, he will have helped change America. But it will be by drawing the contrast. Remember, all these people who are opposed to Republican health reform gave us Obamacare, which is collapsing. All these people who are opposed to education reform gave us the inner city unionized schools that don't teach anything and trap the poor in ignorance. All these people who are worried about what Trump's doing in the Middle East were failing to protect America. So I think it's important to look at the contrast. It's not Trump versus perfection. It's Trump versus a left-wing system that was failing America.
Well, you look at this trip, though, right, Speaker? I mean, this is the first international trip. What they chose is visiting the three major religions of the world, first here in Saudi Arabia, then Jerusalem, then eventually going to the Vatican. What do you make of the significance of the very first place he visits internationally being Saudi Arabia? I mean, that's a pretty big statement, a pretty big move.
Right. First of all, every time I watch Trump, he plays guts ball. He's always prepared to go straight for it. He knew that this would electrify the Arab world. He knew that it would thrill the Saudis. I must say, watching last night, Wilbur Ross do the sword dance was a little bit. I had to text him, and he texted me back and said, "Watch a little longer. I'm going to try to teach a falcon how to do the sword dance." But here was the point of that. First of all, I was amazed that the Secret Service tolerated the president dancing in the middle of 100 guys with swords.
Amazing.
But think about the signal this sent, that Americans can be happy with Saudis in a way that sends a signal to the entire Middle East utterly different than the elite American media wanted to send. I think this is why this is such a historic trip. And I believe when they go to Jerusalem, it's going to be historic. And I know that Pope Francis is eager to sit down and talk with the president, so that this is going to continue to be, I think, a historic trip that is remarkable.
Do you think, you brought up a few minutes ago the counterterrorism center in Riyadh, which you think is incredibly important, and I do as well, and I'm just hoping that it has enough teeth, that it's not just a symbolic gesture, that the House of Saud will utilize this, that they will go after those even in their own country who are we're looking at some of the sword dancing
from yesterday.
There's the sword dance.
Just for you, Speaker.
who are funding these Islamic terrorists. Do you think it will have the teeth that we want it to have?
Well, first of all, notice that they just got all of the Gulf state countries to sign an agreement on cutting off terrorist funding through their banks. That's a big step forward, because 2 or 3 years ago they were told you they weren't doing any of it. Right. Now they're telling you they can quit doing the stuff they would never tell you they were doing. Second, I think it's very important to put this in context. In 1990, the Saudi kingdom came under enormous attack from people like bin Laden because they had Westerners in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi king's title, remember, is the protector of the 2 mosques and king of Saudi Arabia. So there was this whole sense you can't allow foreigners to be here. Now we're going to set up a permanent counterterrorism center, organizing information, tracking things. And I noticed yesterday, for example, that the foreign minister was very clear that the bombing of the Khobar Towers, which, by the way, the Clinton administration desperately tried to avoid investigating because they didn't want to know that it was the Iranians. The bombing of the Khobar Towers was done by the Iranians, and they still have the bombers hiding in Iran and will not return them to Saudi Arabia. Now, for that statement to come out in a press event like that from the Saudi foreign minister, I mean, we are getting to a clarification of this fight in a way that's amazing, partially driven by the rise of groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda, partially driven by the rise of Iran, and the fact that as the Saudis look at the modern world, they have to modernize. They know that. The younger generation, the Crown Prince, for example, is a big advocate of modernity. I think it was no minor thing that both Melania Trump and Ivanka came off without a headdress. That they are, again, if you notice, the interpreter who's with the president does not have on a headdress. I mean, there's a gradual signal here to women in Saudi Arabia that their future, I think this year they're going to probably be allowed to go without a headdress, and they're probably going to be allowed to drive. That may not seem like a giant breakthrough, but the very fact that the president includes women's rights right in the middle of that speech, delivered to all of these countries, is an enormous shift from the kind of pandering that Barack Obama was doing.
Mr. Speaker, he ran on a platform of America First on foreign policy, and that's what voters voted for, not to be intervening as much around the world and keeping America safe. Tell us how this trip so far, in the ways in which it has embodied this America First approach.
Well, Secretary Tillerson was extraordinarily clear yesterday in the press conference of saying, look, we want to help arm you and equip you because that way you can defend yourself as our ally, which makes it less dangerous and less expensive for us. And I think they see this notion. There's been a real growth in Trump, partly because of Mattis and McMaster and Tillerson, in understanding that we want to be partners around the world. Not that we want to withdraw from the world, but that we want to make sure that our partners are equipped and trained and prepared so they can win most of these fights with only modest amounts of American involvement. And I think that in that sense, this trip is both economically great for America. I mean, the number of jobs they're going to create is really quite impressive. It helps the American military because it lowers the cost per unit of production. And at the same time, it strengthens an ally who will now be strong enough to stand up to the Iranians much better than they were.
Yeah, Speaker, stand by. We want to bring in Dr. Ahmed. I want to get your thoughts just on what the Speaker was saying there.